Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, a show about writing and publishing with your host, J.F. Garrard.
Welcome to another episode of The Artsy Raven, and today our special guest is Luke Gleeson. Luke owns and operates a number of businesses ranging from consultation to film and media services. As a businessman and member of the Tsay Keh Dene Nation, he has experience as a former member of the council as well as chairman of the board for the TKD Economic Development Corporation and director of lands, resources, and treaty operations. Luke's previous award-winning documentary, The Scattering of Man, is on CBC Gem, and we're speaking to him today because his latest feature documentary, Wədzi, a Caribou Country, is part of the Whistler Film Festival in 2025. So welcome.
Thank you. You were close on all.
Okay.
I'm from the Tsay Keh Dene Nation, and I know you didn't try to attempt to say Dene Yi'INJETL, the scattering of man, and our new film is Wədzi Nəne.
Awesome. Okay, now tell me, how did you become a filmmaker?
I was sort of I guess it was born out of necessity. We started to create what became the scattering of man. I was approached by the elders. Through my work, I do a lot of engagement and work very closely with the elders through language programming and through lands programming. And they essentially had told me they're ready to tell their story. And so I was very protective of that to make sure that it was done properly. And we started filming, and I just felt the vision wasn't where we had wanted it to be. I wrote the storyboard for that film in a cabin up in Two Daddy Lake in the northwestern portions of our territory, and got the approval on the storyboard. We went down the Finley River about 60 kilometers to a place we call Fishing Lakes, where the chief was at, and he read the storyboard in front of the fire, essentially gave us the green light on the story there. I felt that we needed to make sure that we were honoring our people's history and their personal stories. They're not easy stories to tell. Some people didn't opt in to be a part of the film because there were some pretty hard stories in there. So I was lucky enough to meet two of my current partners in Messelinka Films and Messelinka Media through that process. So we started filming in 2015. I sort of came in and took over the role of director and producer to make sure that we could honor that story and tell it the way that was envisioned in that initial storyboard. And we've sort of been just making films ever since. So I didn't wake up one morning and say, I'm going to be a director. But there's what I call hidden histories in the country of Canada. And a lot of those hidden histories are, nations' histories and nation stories. And when somebody trusts you enough to allow that story to be shared, then, we definitely want to make sure that we do it with the most respect and integrity that we can, so people, can feel that their story has a soft landing and has been, held and taken with care. So that's a very long roundabout way of how I ended up in the film business and became a director.
Well, tell me a little bit about The Scattering of Man for people that aren't familiar. Just a little bit about what it's about, and I believe it's based in British Columbia, right, where you are?
Yeah, so my people, the Tsay Keh Dene people, were very much, still living off the land when WC before the WC Bennett Dam was established. So yeah, at the time, the social credit government in British Columbia was pushing for these mega projects, right? They had nationalized a number of businesses, BC Hydro, BC Tel, BC Rail. And as a part of that, they had, signed the Columbia Basin Treaty, which all these years later, now currently they're modernizing that treaty with the states. Following the signing of that, they received a large parcel of funding money through the treaty that they then began to develop the W.C. Bennett Dam. Our people were still very much living off the land and traditional ways of life. And because it was pushed so quickly, and even to date, if you read anything through sort of the dominant culture's history, they say that it was completed in record time. Um, that caused a number of issues. One, you had all these people still living there. Two, they had no idea what they were going to do with the wildlife and the habitat. They had no plans for the massive scale of logging that would take place. So they brought in laternal tree crushers that essentially pulled down trees. They had cats with chains pulling trees down. A lot of trees were left uncut. Some of them were left downed. One of those massive tree crushers is still sitting at the bottom of the reservoir. Um, so in order to get this project out, they're doing all of these different initiatives, and at the same time, they forget that there's people living there. So my
That's
people,
pretty crazy, actually. Yeah.
yeah, it was 1966, I believe, when people were coming back, because you have your main homes, and a lot of people's main homes are Red Ingenika Point, Police Meadows, Fort Graham, up and down the Finley, and then you have your different areas that you manage and your trapping cabins and your other cabins. People came back before the winter to get ready to go out trapping, and their homes were burnt down.
My God.
And so they experienced right there loss, um, with just like the simple, um, you know, affordability of being afforded a home before winter time. So a lot of people actually had spent the winters in tents and living along the river, trying to figure out what's going on here. And at the same time, we were experiencing the residential school taking kids. We were experiencing the 60s scoop. There was just a number of things happening. It was like all out warfare on my people, from a spiritual sense. And, within 2 years, that dam was flooded. To this day, they estimate, somewhere around over 12,000 moose died as a part of that flood. Some of our people drowned and died as a part of that flood. Some of the kids were so sick they were stuck on boats for days and days at a time because there were so many logs because they hadn't logged properly that they couldn't get out. So we told the story, and we were approached by people. There's a part in the film that always strikes me hard, and it's Sylvia Pierre talking, and she says, this is the first time I've talked about it. I know I have to talk about it. And she talks about her parents drowning, and it's incredibly difficult when you're filming that
Yeah.
to sit there with somebody, because you can't just say okay and scene and we're done. Thanks, Sylvia, for coming out and telling me
Yeah.
this horrible story about what happened to you. And so it's because of that. When we told that story, it took us 5 years because we
Hmm.
didn't know until the third shoot who the participants were going to be, because some people were still heavily traumatized from the events. But I think in a lot of ways, people being able to share that part of the history, their own personal pieces of those history, I believe, and I can't speak for the individuals, but I believe that was a part of their healing journey, and being able to, say like, okay, I've now claimed my story. And um, once we got the story out there, it was something else. It was kind of like wildfire. All of a sudden, we were finding out these stories are existing kind of across North America with these dam projects that were rushed to make happen. And, we call it a vanity project, a provincial vanity project. And some of that old propaganda, the old films that they have out there, and some of the stuff they said about my people it's pretty crude. And they said there's nobody living there except for a small group of Indians. Well,
Mhm.
there's people's whole life. We've been there since time immemorial to just sort of brush us off you know, in a sentence or two, to brush off our whole nation in a sentence or two. It just never, you know, it obviously didn't sit well with us, but to me, it's like at a provincial standpoint, it should sit well with nobody because this can happen, very easily if we don't have parameters in place, proper policy, proper legislation to protect people, and I'm not just talking about First Nations, anybody
Anybody, it's true.
who's in the line of development. Development is necessary for the world we live in, but you got to balance what that cost is versus and sustainable sort of livelihood and what it looks like versus what do we actually need to sustain ourselves spiritually, holistically on the earth here in this province as people. And I see, like, as we're fast forwarding and we're zooming through right now into the future is, with this development as it is currently in the current policy and legislation for permitting, I just see a lot of division that is created even deeper and deeper and further and further. And I think that's why those stories are important. And that's why we wanted to tell that story is, this is a real part of your history is in British Columbia. And today when people call it a lake, it drives me absolutely insane. I'm like, it's a reservoir, it's a man-made body of water. And to this day, it's still the third largest body of water by volume for a hydroelectric reservoir.
Mm.
And there's some very, very large scale reservoirs out there across the world. And this one still holds the third largest amount of volume. And that to me is saying something when you want to actually wrap your head around how massive those impacts were. So
Now,
that's the gist of the film.
now I did watch a bit of Caribou Country, and I'm just guessing, was it the stories your grandfather told that led you to think, maybe I should focus on the caribou, or?
I've been working on Caribou for the last um, almost 17 years, I guess, when we get into 26 here. Um, I actually originally pitched Knowledge, a short film, a 7-minute film, 5 to 7 minute art kind of art film, which was essentially a love letter to a part of our territory that really meant a lot to me. I'd received a ton of these logging shapes coming in, and I'd already negotiated a number of the major licensees out of those areas. Some of the adjoining areas to that are becoming a indigenous protected and conserved area for the Tsay Keh Dene Nation. The area in question that to me was one of the most important and vital areas to that did not become a part of that. And it was actually BCTS, so BC Timber Supply, which is the government's development arm, uh, tried to collaborate with some of our businesses and essentially wanted to liquidate that valley. And I'd kept people out of there. I'd kept the Canfors of the world, out of this area, like big major licensees who had signed agreements with us. And, we made concessions and we found them volume in other parts of the territory, but we'd all agreed to stay out of it. This is still a major connection for the chase herd. The chase herd is one of the only herds in our territory that's stable, that appears to be stable, and continues to be stable. But for how long? We've just many parts of their territory have just been dismantled by logging and an excuse of pine beetle, and it's volume approach. So grab as much as you can and as close as you can to the log dumps and just knock out valley after valley. So I worked very close with that, and to me, it was you know, if we get to this point where we open up these access into the Chudeze, we're gonna lose all of this. You know, this habitat connectivity is going to be just completely fractured on the western portion of this caribou herd's territory. And so my response was a love letter to the land about the trickster who comes in and takes. And the narrative was the beauty of this area that was so important to me. And so I had the conversation with Gordon Lovren at Knowledge Network, and you know, I said, well, you know, what can I pitch? You know, and he said, well, anything, you know. So I looked at the different things. I was like, okay, I'll pitch you a short. So I pitched him the love letter art film, and he kind of wrote back and said, well, maybe a little bit too artsy. Let's
Okay.
let's focus on, you know. And he said, but what about, tell me more about this caribou. So Patrice Ramsey and Gordon Lovren were just like from the beginning, just super supportive, and wanting to collaborate, which was amazing. And so I started discussing the caribou, and you know, a large part of my conversations through what I do for a living are very caribou centric, because it's not a localized story. The story we're telling is local to the participants in the film, but you can tell the story across Canada. It's across the board. It's happening absolutely everywhere. It's not just unique to us. And it's kind of alarming that it's just still going on, and people I think tend to focus on all the wrong things. They get on hot topic issues. But at the same time, I remember when Pat Bell was in at Kofi in Prince George and said that the Amanika region is the breadbasket of the province. And I was completely shocked that people were standing there clapping. I'm like, well, when this bread goes, it goes south, and we're left with crumbs. And that's not just from a human perspective, that's from habitat, connectivity, forest health, increase of potential, you know, like a lot of these things actually lead to increased predation from line of sight and open visuals and roadways that go absolutely everywhere, which then also increase traffic and access from BC resident hunters, increase access from neighboring Indigenous hunters that probably shouldn't be hunting in our territory to begin with anyways, or not, probably should not be, because to me that's poaching if you're on somebody else's territory shooting caribou. And so like the list goes on and on and on, right? There's just so many, it's a complex thing. So there's so many different factors that are put into it. And somebody down south is getting mad about some wolves getting killed. And I'm not saying that I'm a proponent of shooting wolves, but to me the question is why. It should be like, why are you shooting wolves? You know, why are you opposing logging when mills are shutting down? Why are you, you know, upset with the amount of grizzlies? Because sometimes people down south, they're saying, well, there's no grizzlies left. Well, if anybody's actually read an audited report that comes out of the province, the grizzly are just fine. And then you look at the different impacts to the grizzly, the majority of impacts to grizzly is loss of habitat. It's not hunting. It's none of these things impact them. I think it's like a 1% impact on the grizzly population if you let guide outfitters hunt them. And as I'm saying again, I'm not advocating these things. I'm just saying that because it's so complex, when you're looking at all the different things, you got to kind of have a broader view of it and look at it and say, well, why are all of these things happening? Why are the Tall Tan doing this? Why is the Tsay Keh Dene Nation doing this? You know, why are they penning caribou in northern BC? Why? It's incredibly expensive, and I don't want to live in a future where my kids have penned wild animals that have been here forever, just so that we can keep them on
Like
the land.
building a giant zoo.
Yeah, the BC Zoo, which is across the board, right? And it's going to cost this province probably $1 billion a year to operate. So, when we started looking at not to get overly passionate here, but when we started to have the conversation, it was like, okay, how do I tell this story where it's not my opinion? How do I tell the story where I'm not leading people or, because I'm not trying to create answers. I'm just trying to create discussion. Because when discussion gets shut down, because people don't understand the topic.
Or they get too emotional to one thing, like you said, the wolves, and they get too focused on that, and then they just forget about everything else. So how did you? Yeah, I guess you had to figure out how to tell the story in a way, like as a documentary.
Yeah. So then when I pitched it back, I said, well, we're going to focus on the chase and surrounding herds, but the chase is a stable herd, which is why when we use the mapping, you kind of zoom in and you're sort of seeing all these dwindling herds through the mapping, right? And then you zoom in and there's this stable herd way up in what, some people would describe as the middle of nowhere. But then you see as the maps progress and you start seeing, all of the disturbances surrounding it, and you start to get an idea of, wow, like they really are on an island. These caribou are just becoming more and more forced into these different islands of habitat versus the connectivity, and you're seeing changes in their movement, in their behavior from season to season. Where they would have spread out a lot more across the board in the winter, you're seeing them sort of grouping up a lot more. And I think a lot of that is indications of loss of habitat, poor forest health, the increase of wildfires because we haven't been using wildfires in the land base for the last 100 years. You're starting to see these large scale wildfires, whereas before you wouldn't have those large scale wildfires. We would have put fire on the ground ourselves. So you have all of these different factors that are coming into play. And once you get that visual sense, because we can tell the story, but I think it's also important to give people a little bit of an indication of what the people in the film are talking about. And, so we use the mapping approach, but from the story side, it was like everybody who's in that film has their own story. They're all actively engaged in the Caribou story in one way or another, whether it's Clements Brace with the Tsay Keh Dene Nation, doing the guardian work, and whether it's, you meet Fraser McDonald in the film as a biologist, but he's also a guide outfitter. As you meet him later in the film, he's at his outfitting camps. We have Morgan Anderson from the province, out there trying to do this work with the chase. And then you have my grandfather who's just, he's old school. So, he tells things in a different way, which is, we just wanted that narrative to live and breathe as it would be naturally if a grandfather passed knowledge on, and then, people like me then taking a lead and then passing that on. So we wanted to just allow the audience to kind of just hear these people's stories and not lead them into, here's the way it's supposed to be with caribou. Here's what we need to do. And this guy's bad, that guy's bad. It's a complex topic. There's no easy solutions. And we're not trying to solve the mystery of why all these herds just are continuing to decline. But we want to start a conversation so people can start, hopefully being like, why are there so many wolves in some parts of the province? Because I tell you, when I was out there with the team up there doing the collaring retrievals and everything, if you've ever been to a site where there's a lot of wolf presence, it's right away, it's very identifiable. We went to one site, there was I just couldn't believe the amount of activity that had been in there from wolves. There was scat absolutely everywhere, trails everywhere, beds everywhere, bones and hair, and they had just been taking down moose in that area, and they were knocking out a lot of caribou. And I thought we had some pretty high pressure from wolves in some of our areas, and some of those packs that like that we've seen in our territory, you know, like 25 plus. That's a lot of wolves,
Oh,
all packed up, you know, around a lake in my grandpa's trap line, and they had cubs in the bush. So, you know, I don't know how many cubs they had, but you know, it's a large group of wolves. I was actually shocked when I saw the amount of activity when we were in the Tahltan territory, and just it's like we're flying around doing these collars, and where all this activity is just like, you know, we're in a helicopter all day, and you're not seeing any caribou. You know, they move out of those areas pretty quick when that predation hits those levels,
yeah,
and
you run away.
yeah, I wouldn't be hanging out there in that
I
at
don't
those
think you
kind
want
of.
to hang out there.
I, like I said, like I've seen a lot of wolves, but I was actually shocked when we were up in that area, like how we got out of the helicopter. I'm like, there's scat everywhere. There's trails everywhere down to the creek and up the hillside and everything. I'm sure I mean, I'm like, there's probably like a den around here or something. He's like, oh no, this is just they're hunting this area right now. I was like, wow, that's
Okay. So
yeah.
we have to wrap up. So one more last question, I guess, for anyone that's interested in telling their story. Do you have any advice for them?
Do I have any advice for who?
Or anyone who wants to do a documentary or something?
Yeah. Do I have advice? Maybe find a line of work that pays well and doesn't take years out of your life. No, no, it's I would say you know, we've been lucky. We've been very lucky. We were lucky. The nation, Tsay Keh Dene Nation, you know, was 100% behind Dene Yi'INJETL, the scattering of man. It's the first fully funded independent First Nations feature that's fully funded by a nation, put out by a nation, and you know, it's been international all through the nation itself, right? We are so lucky with Knowledge Network, um, just supporting us and being behind us, and I think the only advice I would give is that I know we've been lucky. You know, we've been able to tell these stories, and you know, we're working on putting together, you know, our next story for, you know, another feature, hopefully that will happen soon here. Um, but I think a lot of times with docs, you know, you don't, you may think you have the story, but you don't really know until you've, you know, put in the time. Um, like with Scattered and Man, we didn't know who our characters were until the third shoot. We did 5 shoots. Not everybody is afforded that, you know, to be able to do that, you know, to film for over 3 years, and, you know, to then have 2 years and to build a film score and to work with like all these different artists and put together your vision, you know. But you know, you can write your storyboard, you can put together whatever it is you think the film is. But with a doc, it always kind of comes through the people, because we're just essentially the thread that's allowing the story to be told. You know, we're just putting it together. And I approach film, and my team approaches film from like a cinematic lens. Like we're focused more on like the tempo, the pacing, you know, and how those images relate to what's being told. How, like, what's your narrative? What are you telling, right? And so with the Scattering of Man, it was the story of Zalia, where you know, the old man's trying to kill him, you know, and never can kill him. That was the whole narrative for the film, is that our, no matter what happens to our people, you know, we're unbreakable. We stay in our land. We always find ways to survive and move on and prosper, to keep our culture alive, to move it forward, to hand it off. With Wədzi, it's, you know, the handing of information is not just from people to the viewer, it's from generation to generation. And my grandfather tells me about um, things in the film, like that the one scene in the film where he's telling me about how, you know, the pine in the spring let off that, you know, the green spores that essentially are like lichen food, right?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for
Yeah,
sharing
he
your
told me.
story.
Okay,
Yeah.
of course.
Wrap it up.
Yeah, you told me that in real time, and I think that that's one thing. Just to finish my thought there for the question is, you don't always know what's going to happen when you're doing a doc in front of that camera.
Yes.
So you let that thread tether the stories, and sometimes when you get to the end, you're like, "This is not exactly what we envisioned, but it's what the story is, and that's what we then present."
Awesome. Well, thank you for spending time with us today.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, that was hopefully relatively painless for you.
Bye. The Artsy Raven is produced by Dark Heel Express. Introduction voiceover by Chris Gorman. Music by Tim Moore. Please access your bonus content on the Patreon website. Thank you very much for listening, and please stay safe.